Oh, it's
Live!
oh my goodness.
Can you believe this? Hey everybody, how are you doing? You've stumbled across that, but just in case you didn't know where you are, this is hashtag SPSM chat. If you didn't know that before, you know it. Now you're different. I'm at Doc Foreman, but you probably knew that too. And I've got a small audience in my dining room. I'm so excited. You can't see, but duck in. We have Dr. Ray Tucker, who is the Student Division Chair on the board at the American Association of Suicidology. And across in my living room making jokes about me with my husband's Dr. Bill Schmitz, past president of the American Association of Suicidology. And you wouldn't think it's the best house party ever because suicidologists, but here you are. You're coming to an hour-long chat, our season 5, to talk about technology, innovation, social media, and suicide prevention. We are so excited. We always have the best guests when we open seasons. And so we're going to get to Kate in just a minute. But before we get there, I would like to introduce my co-producer and partner in crime, Mr. Tony Wood.
Still Mr.
Damn it.
5 years. 5 years. Still Mr. Yeah, so I am the CEO of a company called Quantify. We are dedicated to computer science and mental health, as well as being the chair of the American Association of Suicidology, suicidology.org. Join today. Also, check out ourdatahelps.org. Donate your data.
To prevent suicide.
And other stuff.
Right. And in addition to that, we have the fabulous Dr. Bart Andrews. Bart, say hi to all the people.
Hey, good evening, everybody. It is so amazing to be back. We had a long summer off, and I have to say that I missed being on the show tremendously. A little bit about myself. I am the Vice President of Clinical Practice and Evaluation at a groovy little crisis center in St. Louis, Missouri called Behavioral Health Response. A shout out to any of the BHR folks that are on the thread. I am honored to be on the executive committee of the American Association of Suicidology. And I am so excited about tonight's show. I got to watch some of Kate's stuff earlier, and she's amazing. And then just getting to hear her explain things with April in the pre-show was quite phenomenal. So I think you guys are in for an amazing show.
And not only do we have fantastic Dr. Bart Andrews, but we have Chris Maxwell, who helps us with so much of our video production. And also I got to speak with him in Denver just 2 weeks ago. Chris Maxwell, say hi to the people.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Maxwell. I'm coordinator of member engagement for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. I am excited to learn about, I have to echo what Bart says.
And co-chair.
Oh, and co-chair of the Rapid Response Media team for the American Association of Suicidology. We kind of made up that name, so it's we're still working on it. But yeah, no, I have to echo Bart, and just that I am thrilled to hear what Kate has to say. She's obviously a brilliant human being, so happy to be here. Happy to hear what she's got.
I'm really excited to have Kate. So Kate, Dr. Kate Niederhoffer, who's about ready to introduce herself, I got to meet her in April when SPSM alum Dr. Glenn Coppersmith and Dr. Glenn Moriarty, the Glens as we like to call them, are like, you've got to have lunch with this woman. And I'm like, I'm down to clown. But I go to lunch, and not only is she brilliant, and anybody that Coppersmith and Moriarty want you to hang out with is probably going to be amazingly smart. She has a certain engagement of being. She is charming as can be, an excellent explainer of what's actually very, very technical research, and does research about fascinating things and does it in fascinating ways. And so we were very, very excited to have her, first of all, to kick off our season, but also, and we will be mentioning this throughout the show, is going to be, is on panel picker for South by Southwest with Coppersmith and Moriarty and another person. Is he an SPSM alum? I don't know. Call me. But they're going to be talking about bots, AI, and good applications in the mental health space. And 2017 is going to be the rise of the bots, folks. We're going to, thanks, Tucker. You're going to be hearing a lot about this. We talked about this some. just at the end of last spring when we were talking about cocoa, we were talking with Rob Morris, but we're going to be talking a lot more about having standards, practices, ethics, and understanding about how these technical tools like a software bot might be used in the service of better understanding ourselves and in the service of mental health. So Dr. Kate Niederhoffer, introduce yourself. Tell everybody who you are.
Hi, everyone. I am so glad I didn't wear makeup tonight because I'm just blushing from all of the praise, and hopefully you see my inner sparkle in my eye that doesn't require mascara either, from this close-knit and charismatic tribe-like supportive community. I've never been a part of such a an uplifting group of people. You guys are the most charming yourselves. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here.
I put myself on mute because we have a small house party going on. But Kate, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about you're a person who's been at the intersection of mental health and entrepreneurship in the technology space. And the facts are that while we've had a few guests on the show, that's actually not that terribly common. So would you tell everybody about some of the projects that you've done and how we get to Circadia Labs?
Yes. Okay. So I am a social psychologist by trade and by education. And for the last, let's say, 4 years, I had been working on Sooth, S-O-O-T-H, which is a mobile app for advice. And the idea was to connect people and allow them to anonymously ask for advice on tricky situations, any sort of difficult life situations, whether it was personal, family, friendship, business, and get advice from other people. And we were trying to figure out if there was such a thing as good advice. So I was really going after this need for honesty that people have. And I wanted to understand that scientifically, to know, is there such a thing as one advice that's better than others? Is there something that we should do? Is there a particular style that you should always give advice in? Or are certain types of people or personalities drawn to certain types of advice? So as I was kind of playing around with that data and running this mobile platform, it was acquired by a dream sharing social network. So let me just clarify, it was sort of the non-conscious analog to what I had been doing, the conscious advice solicitation. This is a social network for sharing your nighttime dreams. And the founder and CEO of this company, Dreams Cloud, Jean-Marc Emden, felt that Sooth was an analog to this, that sometimes in waking life matters, people have this need to discuss what is going on in their lives, but as they do in sleep. And so he had been running this social network for about 5 years and had been amassing a huge amount of data, which were the dreams that people were having at night. And he said, I need somebody to figure out what's in this data and what type of value it has. And so funny enough, we had met at South by Southwest. As April mentioned, we do have a session that's coming up that we're hoping to get into South by Southwest. He had come to a panel that I was doing with another one of the panelists who's on this submission, the one you forgot, who is Dr. Jeff Hancock. And he's a psychologist.
He's important. It's just he hasn't been on the show yet.
He will be important once he's on the show.
Right.
So his importance is imminent. And he and I were talking about the bridge between psychological research and business, and whether there are various applications of psychological text analysis and constructs that are untapped in business and in other areas. And so this guy, Jean-Marc, had come to our panel and he said, I have all this data. I need someone to create a lab for me. And so he acquired Sooth. And as part of that transaction, we created this lab, which is called Circadia Labs. And our goal is to explore the data and figure out if there's any untapped value in hundreds of thousands of nighttime dreams. And it turns out there's a lot of value. And the part of the value that interests me the most is in mental health. So I'm increasingly interested in mining the data for psychological constructs, signs of psychological distress, signs of suicidal crisis, picking up on early warning signals for any of these things, and understanding dream data in the same way that people like Tony and Glenn Coppersmith at their company Quantify look at social media, so waking life concerns for mental health.
Once again, super glad to have you, because you actually sort of are, you're a wonderful, clear speaker, but sort of explaining about how these entrepreneurial relationships sort of work. And one of the really important things I think that's important for our audience to understand, and we've talked about this on SPSM before, these data sets are really large, they're very rich, and what they often need are experts to understand them, right? The bots can't tell you what things mean. And so, I know, you know, you sort of see alarmist posts like, oh, what's his face? Elon Musk says AI is going to be the biggest crisis or whatever that we aren't prepared for. In fact, the AI doesn't AI itself. It really takes somebody like Dr. Niederhoffer to sort of understand what is happening. You know, what is the signal on these very, very large data sets. Tell us a little bit. Now, you're a social psychologist. Tell us about how you got to working in the tech space, because, I mean, honestly, just not a lot of psychologists end up there.
Yeah, and let me just say that I wholeheartedly support everything you said about the AI is not taking over, but it doesn't just take me by any means, or just a social psychologist. I think the idea is that machines need to be supplemented and complemented by a whole variety of different perspectives. And I mean, I'm obsessed with perspectives in general. That was my interest in advice in the first place, was just that we all have one way of looking at the world, and it's really helpful to have other people bring to us their perspective of our situations, of other situations. It's, you know, in some ways analogous to an argument for diversity, but specifically having different lenses on a given situation and a given data set are super important. And there are so many different ways. Even within machine learning, there are ways and there are biases. And so it's really important to have humans who have different backgrounds looking at the data. So I really, it's a firm belief of mine in the DREAM data set that, and one of the reasons that I like to work with Glenn Coppersmith too, is because we have overlap in our interests, but we have a lot of differences in the lenses that we use on data. And there are so, I mean, when you start to understand the way that AI works, you realize that there are so many different facets of it. And it's not really like, oh, it's machine versus human. There are different types of machines that have different types of training, just like there are different types of humans with different trainings. And each of them are really important to combine. So sorry, just a caveat, but to answer your question, how did I end up in technology? Okay.
Yeah, like why not do experimental psych at a university somewhere? I mean, you are adjunct, right, at UT? No,
funny enough, I like to say this is like the only TED Talk like thing that I ever say, which is that my confession is I never wanted to be an academic. And I love teaching. I did what?
Dr. Tucker next to me just went, what? Anyway, go ahead.
I love academia. But more than academia, I love psychology. I love understanding people, and I love taking that understanding and applying it to different situations. And what I had studied in grad school was what we can understand about people based on their words. So how do we use approaches to the psychology of language to better understand people? And from there, it's you know, if we have time, I'll tell the long story. Just cut me off when I start to say too much. I was looking for a non-student sample for my dissertation, and I ended up posting a survey on Craigslist in like 2003 or 4, right when it had gotten kind of big. And I was trying to figure out what else was going on Craigslist. And this is a happy story. I didn't find anything scary.
Attached in the Sand Springs Walmart?
Nothing bad. I was just poking around a little, and I saw an ad for this company called Buzzmetrics, which was a startup doing social media mining in 2005 to help brands, companies, products better understand themselves based on this new thing that had just emerged, which were blogs. And they were doing all sorts of natural language processing on blogs, at the time discussion forums, Usenet, to better understand these places. And I was like, you've got to be joking. This is an application of what I'm doing. and it's not involving a student sample, and it's in the real world, and I just found it so exciting, and I applied and got that job, and I went to visit, and I fell in love with startups.
So you got into this because you answered an ad on Craigslist. I just want to make sure I got the too long don't read on that.
I wish I could say that was all it took, but you know, my charm, I had to use it.
I do too every time I use Craigslist, but that's a different job.
You know, it's like human and machine, Craigslist and charm. Oh my gosh, delete.
So Marshman, who's one of our regulars, was like, you know what, he just had a tweet where he was saying, there are biases in machine learning. Like, I didn't know that. And I think that there's probably, in psychology, we're always talking about biases and thinking of them as subjective humans, that we are sort of imperfect and have biases. We don't often think of the software bots and the math having biases.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let me try to do this with an example with the dream data. So one of the questions is, you know, let's say in therapy, because that's an area where people always worry that bots are going to try to replace therapists. And so they'll say, okay, let's create a bot that is really, I was going to say superhuman, but what I mean is extensively human. And let's teach it to have emotional capabilities, and let's teach it to talk like a therapist. So we have to train this bot. It has to learn how to be that person that we've described. And we essentially have to feed the bot data. So we have some choices to make. We could feed it therapeutic data. We could feed it a script that we come up with that's more of a decision tree. If somebody says this, then say that. And each of these decisions that we make about what data, how much data, how we manufacture or manipulate the data or massage it or cleanse it, each of the decisions that we make about what goes into the machine affects what comes out. And sometimes they don't act like biases in terms of, certainly we're not conscious of the biases that we have. They aren't implicit biases in the sort of more press psychology about the implicit associations task or the way that people talk about implicit biases, but they're just sort of worldviews on what you think is the best gold standard for data to train a computer to learn.
You're telling me that a lot of this machine learning and some of this AI stuff, I mean, it's really like the Legos of computer software, where you're sort of trying different configurations, but the truth is you could build it to do a lot of different things, but the Legos don't build themselves. You have to sort of create something.
Gosh, if only they did, right? I think I'd be more into Legos if that were the case. Absolutely. I mean, you have to build it to have the capacities that you want it to have. And I think it's really more specific to the way that you train it. It's just like humans, the schooling that you have, the worldviews that you're exposed to, the diversity that you're exposed to, and also the outcome that you want to achieve. So that's something that's really important to think about with bots is even, you know, within therapy, what is the outcome that they're going for? So a lot of the sort of mental health bots that are getting some press these days, they have a specific outcome like a reduction in anxiety, or I'm here to talk about your mood with you. And so they're really specifically trained to understand that domain and have that domain expertise.
So, you know, and I'm going to have Chris and Max will sort of chime in and do a couple of follow-up questions, but I mean, that really, you know, when I'm thinking about, you know, what I do as a therapist, I'm not always reducing someone's anxiety. Sometimes I'm doing things that I know is like if we're facing something very scary, we're doing something that's temporarily going to make things more anxiety provoking. We're going to sort of face some things that are really, really hard. You know, I'm thinking of things that I've asked people to do that are no fun. I'm thinking of things that we've done for insomnia or sleep that were really, really painful, and you don't sleep well. So, you know, it sounds like in a lot of ways, the current mental health bots are pretty linear in terms of like, they're very focused in domain and sort of linear in what they're trying to get done. Do I understand that right?
I mean, I think it's still relatively early for bots and mental health, and I think that's why we have a big opportunity to have an open discussion about this and to understand some of the ethical ramifications as well, and to really think about I mean, a lot of the stories that are getting publicized right now are cases gone wrong, you know, so examples of people who are experiencing some form of psychological distress and they're interacting with the bot and the bot is getting it wrong and exacerbating that distress. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a mistake to say that they're linear, because one of the things that is so fascinating about machine learning and other forms of natural language processing is that you can introduce a lot of multidimensionality. You can really introduce human-like, what seems like intelligence. And it's pretty impressive, and I think it's increasingly awesome. But I think you have to be really aware of the way in which a bot is trained, the outcome that it's trying to achieve, and then also understand how transparent is this a bot or not.
And we will definitely talk about that more in the ethics section when we sort of start talking about that at the end. But I mean, what you're telling me is that the bots may have a therapeutic orientation, sort of.
Definitely. I mean, remember Eliza was Rogerian.
Mm-hmm. I forgot about that. Stop, Tucker. Like, it's been a minute since I've talked about Eliza. I'm going to take a minute to round with some of our other moderators. Tony, you have been really, really reacting. Talked with Kate about some of the things that you're noticing.
I think it's a really important point to say that machine learning is a technique and not magic. And Kate has done a fantastic job of making clear for the audience that may or may not care to know, but they now know that machine learning is a wonderful thing, but it's a tool just like many other tools. And so if you take a screwdriver and build furniture, or you can, pull apart the appliances, whichever way you'd like to go.
Okay, Bart. You're making Bart face. Tell us a little bit about what's happening on the Twitter stream and sort of feedback to Kate, a little bit about some of her explanations about these things.
Well, the SPSM feed is popping. So the thread's amazing. So I think there's a lot of conversation going on. I think heavy audience, right? And so as Kate is talking about, machine learning has bias in it, and can have bias in many different ways. Lots of people are probably saying, of course it can. They're throwing out some really good articles about this. So I don't know what group of mental health and suicide prevention advocates that you can pull together and throw out something like bias in machine learning, and people are like, oh heck yeah, there's bias in machine learning. That's pretty cool, actually. But I think one of the things that Kate gets at that I think is really important is what is the goal that I'm using this particular algorithm for? And then when I'm trying to meet that goal, what choices am I making that can potentially create some bias or create some challenges, and how do I account for that? And I think that as she's walking us through this, it's really clear this isn't magic, right? There's a tremendous amount of thought and reasoning that goes into how I'm going to use these really cool mathematical tools that we can do with high-end computing to crunch data, right? And I think that the more that we kind of have transparency around that, I mean, she alluded to bot transparency, which I can't wait to talk about, because that's really fascinating. And there was a great study, Brian Mashara in Montreal did a study where people could not tell the difference when they were talking to a bot versus talking to a live person. And in fact, they were more likely to believe that a real person was actually a bot, and more likely to think the bot was a real person. So this is one of those, Brian Mashara, Montreal.
Kate, do you know about this? Is Bart just quoting things that I haven't read?
I actually don't know about this study. I think it's super interesting, but we should come back to that idea, because that's one of the things that I'm really interested in with respect to dreams as well, and that not only can people sometimes not differentiate a person from a bot, but in certain situations, people have a preference for a person or a bot. Each is relevant. And when it comes to this novel in some cultures, practice of sharing your nighttime dreams or sharing particularly vivid or dreams replete with psychological constructs, whether distress or well-being. Do we have a preference for doing that with a human or a bot? You have to study that in some way and you have to test it out. And so, you know, that kind of touches on what we were just discussing, as well as the ethical ramifications.
That is so interesting. So we have to round back on what bot transparency is. And then I have to think through, because there are times when I'm using bots for customer service things when I don't want a bot, and there are times when I definitely do. And I had not thought about this in terms of mental health. Like when I need to do something that's routine and I know it's routine and I just need to, you know, put the order in, plug in the numbers, do whatever, and I don't need much. That's one thing. But when I really hate when I get sent to a bot when I'm trying to solve a difficult customer service problem that I know something unusual has gone wrong, like my order's been lost in some way or whatever, and I need a perk because I'm tired of screwing with the bot until it gets me to a person. And I had not thought about when I preferred one or the other. And people, and I will say, when customer service land, from the queen of ordering things online because busy, like they do tell you when you're chatting with a bot. But in mental health, I guess I'm sort of shocked that we wouldn't tell people about that. Tell us a little bit more about bot transparency.
Well, a lot of, like, I was kind of talking about some of the press that's coming out about things like Wobot. So the mental health bot out of, well, it's a partnership, I think, between Stanford and Facebook, but it operates through Facebook Messenger, created by a woman named Allison Darcy. And I know that with Wobot, they're really sure to say that, you know, I'm Wobot, I'm not meant to be a person, I'm meant to have these types of qualities, and I'm here to talk about your mood. So it very specifically and explicitly points out that it is a bot and what it's here to do. I'm really curious, Bart, to hear more about that study and if it was, like, you know, how advanced or sophisticated the bot was and what the intent of having people try to guess whether it was a bot or not. And it almost reminds me of some early theory of mind studies, like in the 80s, that were looking at children's understanding of mythical creatures and real versus fantasy. They would ask for, you know, a number of figures and mythical creatures or holiday-like creatures and superstars, and they would say, is this real or fantasy? And they would look at the classification, but then they went back to those early studies where they would say, like, oh, children don't know anything, and they would ask about the different attributes. So great, you performed fairly poorly in saying whether it was real versus fantasy, but do each of these entities sleep? Do they eat? Do they dream? So they were looking at, do they still give them human-like characteristics, whether or not they're real or fantasy? And they found that, like, adults and children perform somewhat similarly, despite adults having a better means of classifying real and mythical figures. It's a complex interaction of study, and I probably shouldn't have derailed this conversation, but I think it brings up an interesting way to look at whether or not we're interacting with a bot and what that means to us. Because, you know, like April said, this is all new. In some ways, it's this Wild West idea that, you know, computers and driverless cars, you know, can do these amazing things. But what does it really mean for us to say the AI, the bot, the machine learning technique, you know, or like all these different types of machine learning that we're throwing around without really knowing what they mean? What type of attributes are we associating with them? So I would love to see that study and figure out how they, what that really means when they said people thought they were interacting with a human when it was really a bot.
Yeah, so
Wow.
I think so. I'm going off what Brian Mashura quoted. The way that he sets the study up is that it was a chat bot, and I think, Chris, you were there when he was talking. I mean, you might have been there one of the times he was talking about this. I think it was a crisis chat bot of some sort, And so it was folks who were engaging in some sort of crisis chat. Some of the folks were getting a bot, some of the folks were getting a person, and folks were not particularly savvy about what a bot was and what a person was. So there was no transparency, and they're making that judgment based on the narrative. And I think that this is what's really interesting to me, is how hung up people get on this. It's really interesting to me. It's kind of like, and I'm going to bring this in, just with the recent issues with the protests in Charlottesville. A bunch of doctors came out and talk about how people, when they come into the ED and find out that they're not white, how they don't want to see them, right? So who gives a crap if it's a bot that's helping me or a person? If I'm getting the same benefit from it, why should it make any difference? Even though I do believe in the transparency, right? So, but I think it's really interesting when we start talking about bots doing therapy, people get really worked up. And what I find utterly compelling about this whole thing is that, well, I'm just going to say this. Human therapists suck. A lot of human therapists are really bad at what they do. And I think, yeah, I just said it. I did. And in terms of being able to predict risk behavior, right? In terms of being able to predict risk, we're absolutely horrible at it. Absolutely bad. We're worse than chance. And you got to work pretty hard to be worse than chance. There was a great study out of England that showed that psychiatrists, in terms of predicting risk level, were atrocious. But if you looked at their body language could predict suicide risk better than their actual overt decision-making about risk. So one of the things that I see that machine learning and artificial intelligence can help is help us, prompt us for these things that our overt reasoning is missing, right? And to me, I'm agnostic about the whole bot versus human. If bots can do therapy better than humans, then I say let the bots do the therapy. I'm 100% for it, because I've referred folks up for therapy, and the experience that they had coming back talking about their therapist, I'm like, you've got to be friggin' kidding me, right? So, hey, we can standardize it. What the heck? Put us all out of business. I love it.
As you can see, Kate, and I don't know what you know about suicide prevention, but one of the things Philip Resnick was talking to us about, and I don't know if he was doing the scenario, we were sort of talking about some research he was doing, I think, offline, and he was saying that if they could design, that already we can use linguistics to assess suicide risk with half of the error of a clinical psychologist, but there's something about the amount of error that we're willing to tolerate in AI doing it versus what we'd be willing to tolerate with a real person. And so, like, some weird biases and perceptions about that.
I don't know about that research, but I do know Phil. And yeah, I can't really speak to the applications for suicide prevention right now. I think that's something that I really want our DREAM data set to be used for, and I don't know the best way to do that. And I hope that this community will reach out to me with any ideas about that, just backing up a little bit from bots, just understanding what would those signals look like in DREAM data if we're looking to prevent suicide. What do we look for in terms of suicidal crisis? What do we look for in terms of the kind of dotted trail that might lead up to that, or rather the lack of the dotted trail? So when we were talking a little bit before about sleeplessness or nightmare or sleep disturbances, what would we look for in the data that we do have prior to signs like that might help us in suicide prevention? So this is kind of a two-sided conversation, in some ways it's like, here's the data set, how can we use this data to help us learn and maybe create a bot that, might assist in suicide prevention, or how can we take this data and just learn as humans to, to do machine learning and to identify signals of psychological distress so that we can better understand what this looks like and how it unfolds.
You were saying something during the pre-show that was really interesting when you were talking about analyzing the DREAM data, which was that you were surprised about some of the ordinary things or the expectable findings. That things were stunning in their ordinariness. I would love for you to talk a little bit about that in terms of the importance of data science, confirming things we think we know, but we actually haven't had data for.
Yes, and I love the way that you put that about the beauty and the ordinariness, because as a social psychologist, if there's one thing that gets me excited, it's the ordinary. I mean, we really love studying ordinary people. If you can find one, I'd love to know them. So one of the things that one of the things that is really interesting about dreams is that they play a huge emotional regulation function. And so hopefully we can come back to this too, because this is like a great branching off point for many things, from machine learning for emotions to what I plan to talk about and now almost forget. But in their emotion regulation function, one of the manifestations of that in text is the extent to which people talk about other people. Because by definition, our interpersonal interactions are emotional. And so we dream about those characters, those individuals in our lives, because those interactions are replete with emotion. And so one of the things that we see in dreams is that people dream a lot about their friends, their home, their work, all the things that happen in waking life. And this is said to be evidence of the continuity hypothesis, that dreams are an extension of our waking life. And that is endlessly interesting to me, that our minds are on 24 hours a day. And in some, whether we're processing, rehashing, preparing for, rehearsing, whatever it is that, because scientists still debate the purpose of dreams, why it is that these happen, we know that it is a continuation of our waking lives. So I'm hoping that that makes people in this community excited to some extent to think that it is a rich data source for us to better understand suicide and to better do suicide prevention.
So, in terms of like the, studying ordinariness, things that we have data for, a lot of things that we talk about in suicide, suicidology, are things that we're sort of guessing at, or things we're sort of seeing, but we might not have good data for in a much more empiric way. And so for me, the idea that we might, we're saying what we think are narratives about how it is that people come to be suicidal and then die by suicide. But these are just sometimes just really, really, I don't want to say they're a little bit better, they're step above educated guesses. It would be great to have a lot of data to support that, right?
To round it out.
That's what's like possible. And so these software bots, these might be able to crawl through really, really large data sets and help us like figure out patterns that work for helping people and tell us something about people who are at risk of suicide. Something we didn't, something we think that we know, but we don't know that we know yet, right?
Right. Well, it's funny. I'll just point out one thing you said about having software bots kind of crawl through the data. Just to kind of show you my bias and where I stand on human and machine, whenever I think of bots, I always think that their strength will be in the interactivity component. When I think of a bot, I think of how do we train a piece of software to act better than a script, to act like a human in responding to people and be really communicative. But when I think of the data analysis part, I always think human first. I think of people crawling through the data and informing the machine what to look for. I think that the best machine learning is done with a huge amount of human first, in between, and in interpretation.
So there isn't a part where the machines come back and say, dude, Dr. Niederhoffer, over here.
One of them, so we keep talking about Glenn Coppersmith, the illustrious computational linguist and CEO of Quantify. Coppersmith and a colleague, Jonathan Schler of mine, and I, and a couple of people on Glenn Coppersmith's team, Patrick Crutchley and Kate Lovies, we all just published a paper for computational linguistics and psychology about this dream data set. And one of the most fascinating things about that project, the paper itself and just the collaboration, was having a computer scientist, a computational linguist, and a social psychologist all working together on this one data set. And we all had very different interests in the data, takeaways from the data, ideas for how to approach the data. So let me be really specific with some examples. I really wanted to look at emotions in the data. So we know that dreams have a huge emotion regulation function. So tell me about the emotions in the dream data, computer. Okay, so my approach to do that is to look at the specific words that people use to express emotions. So we look at words like good, happy, excited versus sad, scared, frustrated, angry. You know, you could go on, and in fact, there are programs that have these dictionaries already created so that we don't have to be so biased as to just look for the ones that happen to be on our mind. So that's my approach. I used a text analysis package called Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count. And I basically do counts of the certain types of positive emotion or negative emotion types of words that are there. Now, while a computational linguist likes to count, they don't like to use, some of them don't like to use lexicon-based approaches. They like to use character-based models. And so they will take a data set in which it's already labeled, or in which you have a human label it to say, this is what happiness looks like. This is what sadness looks like. This is what anger looks like. And you don't have to be so dependent on the words. There are other ways to do it too. You can be way more dependent on the computer and just say, you know, kind of show me the space here so that I could retrieve the most documents that are associated with positive emotion words. And so each of us just had these instincts that were kind of built into us as to how we wanted to extract emotion from the data. And then when we received the results, you know, we were all sort of compelled by different things. You know, the computer scientist is like, oh, wow, we retrieved, you know, this % of the entire corpus. We did a great job with the information retrieval. And the computational linguist is like, oh, yeah, every document has a max probability of a given emotion. And I'm like, ooh, look at the way people express happiness in dreams. It's so different from the way they express happiness in social media. And, you know, so it's just like, I mean, who can even remember the question that you just asked me? But hopefully I've given you a colorful example of why it's interesting to have different lenses on the data, mixing humans and machines not feeding you answers.
You know, what you're describing sounds a lot more like a humanities project than a data science project. And I'm really taken with that. Like, I think that everybody thinks that you just sort of click the start button and the bots do something, but you're really telling me how much, I don't want to say art or artistry, because that's not quite what I intend or what I mean, but like that there is certainly method or technique, and that there's preference, and that there's bias in what people pick. And that if you are looking at a bot that is either combing through data or engaging with people on a product or whatever, understanding what went into it really, really actually matters.
Oh my gosh, it really matters. So what goes into it, and what, just like in, you know, and it's funny because in, I guess, clinical psychology, you don't do this as much as kind of in the entrepreneurial circles that I run with. They would say like, well, what are your goals? You know, it's like a classic business question. Well, what are your goals? What are you trying to achieve? And that's, you know, something that psychologists aren't so blunt as to say something like that. With the exception of Dr. Foreman.
I recited at the beginning of sessions, and then I refer to it repeatedly. I'm terrible.
Well, but you know, I think that's really interesting in therapy, and I'm so embarrassed, but I read what I'm about to say is a fascinating article, and it was in some mainstream, you know, magazine. It's not like I'm talking about some psychology study, but it was about big data approaches to therapy, and it was about this huge trial that was run with patients filling out all sorts of surveys prior to having therapeutic sessions, and how this therapist was sort of saying like, you know, you kind of develop a knack when you're a therapist, and you don't really need data, and it's really, you know, you can pick up on these signs. And she was saying how, you know, therapeutically, her patients seemed to be doing really well. Just sort of at the end of the session, she would note like things are going well, but there was all this people pleasing and self-report bias that was happening. And she, you know, was, because she was exposed to all this data, she picked up on a signal that that her knack wasn't letting her be privy to. And so it's the opposite side of the coin, is that yes, we all have experience and bias and a perspective that we take on the data, and sometimes that we get carried away with that. Sometimes we forget that we have that bias, or we become so trusting in our way of assessing the world or assessing the data that we forget to take other approaches, or we forget to look at the data, we err on the side of human, and we miss something very important.
It is astonishing how much machine learning starts to sound like these much more humanities-driven processes. I'm feeling bad because I'm really excited that you were here, and I'm hogging you just a little bit, so I'm gonna check in with the rest of the moderators, but I want to get back to a comment from the Twitter stream eventually. Maxwell, any thoughts?
I had to unmute myself. I'm sitting over here breathing heavily and just excited about everything that Kate is saying. And so many things have kind of come through. Yeah, just but Kate, your points about theory of mind were just kind of stunning to me. The idea that and it makes sense, and I don't know why it's never something that I've actually thought about in terms of creating a baseline for the knowledge and training, but thinking about what other people are thinking about is the basis for what we're trying to do. And so why not have that extension in a bot technology, a software technology that is doing these things. Another thought that came up was the direct result that I've seen in this kind of confusion between the confusion and the ability to open up to either a bot or a human being in a very direct way. I used to work for a crisis line in which I helped get onto a chat, crisis chat software. And the unexpected result of having to go in and train everybody to not sound like a robot was hilarious and stunning. The idea that we had to train humans in ways to not sound like robots, whereas a robot doesn't have to work that hard. You basically just say, these are the parameters that we're setting up.
This is totally related to Rudy's text, which he said, he talked about the bots on Facebook sounding fake, and whether the humans sound fake or the robots sound fake, there is something that there is a tone that can be done by humans and done by bots that is very off-putting. But I couldn't put my finger on explaining it, but people do report this.
So the thing that we found, and the thing that the Lifeline now trains on in their manual is to focus on things that are very emotional and specific to the individual that we're working with. So we either repeat their name, or we give them our name or an alias or whatever. Or talk about a location that we're both familiar with. So bringing it back to a personal level, instead of saying like, how's it going tonight? How can I help? Those kinds of nice, very neutral things are the things that end up putting people off. Even going so far as to make clear efforts to focus on the emotions that people are saying, but in a way that isn't related to the technology or the setting being used. So we're colloquially used to saying things like, it sounds like, but when you're just chatting with someone, you're not hearing them. And so that's normal for you to type, that's normal for you to say. But if you try to enhance it to the technology and say, it seems like, or it looks like, or you're typing these things, if you try to use those specific languages to the setting, that's what throws people off. And people are like, you don't sound like a human.
I think that's a really big idea, and I think that we need to all pay attention to the fact that with the uptick in bots and scripts in general and customer service as well as in therapeutic settings, that we have this kind of hypervigilance for humanness, that we are seeking without an operating definition of what it means to be human, and specifically what it means to express emotion. And so, you know, those of us who are parents can kind of resonate with that experience, like when you're trying to, and not even as a therapist, as a parent, validate your children's emotions. Sometimes you feel really saccharine where you're like, I'm sorry that you're feeling sad, you know, and like that sounds like a robot mom, by the way, you know, but what you're saying about, I just wrote this down, personal as emotional, that, you know, you kind of talked about these neutral things, and just saying somebody's name is an expression of emotion. And, you know, gosh, if there's one area that gets me super excited in terms of April, she's all ears.
One, but I want to know if there is.
It is, how do we detect emotions in text, knowing that they're very idiosyncratically expressed? And I mean that in terms of individual differences in expressing them, and also real subtleties in the way that we can express emotion through content that isn't inherently emotional. So if you think back to what I was saying about the different methods of text analysis for identifying, you know, a given entity in text, like, you know, does that mean that word or lexicon-based approaches are no good for emotion, or does that mean that they get you a certain percentage of the way? Well, if we're using a character-based model, sure, that's better in terms of bypassing self-report of emotion, but let's talk about how that data set was trained or labeled to pick up on emotions. Was it based on people saying, I am sad, or was it based on a therapist saying that in this situation, it was a patient with an anxiety disorder who expressed a lot of anxiety at this line right here in the transcript? You know, like, how are we picking up on that? And, you know, Chris, as you're saying, what if we start to say like, oh, right here where Chris says Kate, that was an expression of emotion. First of all, what type of emotion? And every time somebody says my name, is that emotion? I mean, I don't know. I'm just bringing up some of these issues, which could also be some ethical conundrums, because, you know, what if we are doing early signal detection and we say when somebody uses these, these words or these patterns, they tend to be highly emotional, and we're pointing towards the wrong things, or we're responding in the wrong way because we're misinterpreting the cues. So there are a lot of repercussions of what we're talking about right now. And that's why I think it's so exciting. Like, there's no answer. How, like, we don't know that much about humans, and it's 2017.
So we got to lean in. So Tony and I have had this little tete-a-tete speaking about emotions and not recognizing them. And I find this really interesting, where I will, like, in a really matter-of-fact way, he'll talk about something. We were talking about a board matter or something, and he was feeling sort of tired and put upon. And I said, I'm sorry that you're tired and put upon, and we still have to, whatever. He goes, you don't sound sorry. And I'm like, I really am sorry. I do regret that we need to take care of this today. I know you aren't feeling well. It's like, you don't sound sympathetic. And I felt sympathetic and did not sound like that. And Tony, do you remember this conversation in the Whole Foods?
You do it all the time. She does this shrink mode thing she does because she has to have these conversations all the time. And so, like, I think that everybody gets used to it eventually. Because she is sincere. It's just that she knows what she's trying to convey to you. And it's just as if your business were fasteners. Like, people who know a lot of things about screws and bolts and nuts just rattle right through it, and they don't take a lot of time to, like, be extra dramatic about the difference between 7/8 and a 14th. You know, it's not a thing. So that's what it's like dealing with psychologists all the time, is that they're like, oh, but have you checked in with your feelings?
The quality is that I've heard somebody be overwhelmed, and we still have to take care of a difficult I've heard it a couple thousand times if I've heard it once. Yes. And I hear it more than the average person, so I don't miss a beat. Yes. You're totally right. And so there's an
it's not just you, by the way. It's like psychologists. That's a thing. But if you hang around with, it's what freaks people out, by the way. One of the things that freaks normal people out about talking over psychologists is that they keep talking even though you're talking. 5 years, everybody. 5 years. Okay.
It's that quality, Chris and Kate. That we're talking. It's the like, because you've been hyper exposed to emotionality, you do some things that are really a little bit more automatic than a normal person. I don't know. What do you think about that, Dr. Niederhoffer?
You guys keep saying normal and ordinary, and those are like my trigger words. I'm a social psychologist, so I'm like, oh, can I get the transcript and study this? Are you guys normal?
Yeah.
That's a hot button word for just about everybody in the suicide prevention space right now, where nobody's sure what normal is, but we're all fairly certain it's bad.
Ain't no such thing, guys and girls.
You and Desiree Stage would get along great.
I prefer Gauss. I'll take Gauss any day.
Dr. Andrews, do you have any thoughts?
I've got many thoughts. I've got many thoughts. One, I think that one of the things that Kate's done an amazing job of talking about is how these new ways of learning give us more ways to ask questions. And she did a great walkthrough about how different professions approach the same data corpus and look at it differently and ask different questions. And this gets to one of my big beefs about academia in general, is it's so utterly sterile and purified, in that everybody in the psychology department is a psychologist. Everybody in a sociology department is a sociologist. Everybody in the social work department is a social worker. That model, all you academics paying attention, that model sucks. We need to have multidisciplinary training, and we need to have multidisciplinary research. Yep. Yeah, see, Ryan knows what I'm talking about. And I'm telling you, I know the old academics, they love when I say this sort of stuff. They just get warm and fuzzy, and they're like, Bart, he just really gets us. Because what Kate's talking about is really powerful. When we have different professionals with different levels of expertise and different ways of looking at the problem, we bring these groups together, that's the only way we're going to move the bar on this stuff. So I just tweeted out a really cool article that gets at what Kate was talking about. And I want to say it's Dr. Montgomery at Brigham Young University has created this questionnaire that therapists are using pre-session. Then every session it gets plugged into a data system, and it gives the therapist real-time alerts so the therapist can actually break out of their mindset. I'm sorry, I'm really hard on therapists, and therapists are wonderful people, but they often are not getting good feedback.
You're not a therapist.
What are you saying? Let me finish. Can I just finish? Can I just finish, April? So, but that's my Ross Perot. How was it, Chris? Was that all right? Can I just finish? That's pretty good. Yeah, how often do you get Ross Perot mentioned? But I think that these are ways that we can use data to make therapists even better at what they're already, some of us, good at.
Go ahead, Kate.
That's all I have to say.
Bart had sat on that for a good 15, 20 minutes. He was tamping that down.
I think it's an awesome point to be interdisciplinary, and I think it's really important to operationalize that idiosyncratically, if I can just start throwing out some big words here. But what I mean is I don't think you mean something as blunt as let's start having psychologists and anthropologists and computer scientists work together, but that sort of granular perspective that I was talking about before of getting diverse peoples with different backgrounds looking at the same problems and asking different questions of it. And I mean, it really is, to me, the best argument for diversity. And you see this happening all the time with something as simple as a data set, and having people of different backgrounds look at it and hearing the questions that automatically come to that, and seeing, how interested they are that somebody has a different question based on the same data. I mean, that's what makes data competitions so interesting, is that people are asking different questions of the data and finding completely different things, and in some ways huge innovations.
A social psychologist, a data scientist, and an app developer walk into a bar. # SPSM. We have blown through final thoughts, and I feel like we've actually gotten several people's final thoughts in there. But Tony, Chris, do you have anything to say in the last 2 minutes of the show?
I knew Kate Niederhoffer was going to be a great guest. Thanks for coming, Kate.
I know, right?
Yeah, real quick. No, the thing that I love about this talk about interdisciplinary intersections and making it personal as possible and looking at things through different lenses. Does anyone get a sense that this is very familiar to the suicide prevention field? Everybody out there, when we're talking about inclusiveness and making sure that we're being diverse in our groups, there are certain groups of people like attempt survivors, loss survivors, who it's very important for us to have included, and to see this not just be a singular issue for what we deal with on a daily basis, but to know that data scientists and people who are working on these tools are thinking the same way, and using bias as an advantageous resource, I think is just, it's thrilling. So it's not really a final thought, but there you go.
Chris is blushing. Dr. Niederhoffer, we are so glad for you to be with us. Everybody check it out. And it's the top of the hour. We had one of our new tweeters who just joined us for this chat talk about how the hour flew by. We're glad. We think it does every week. Remember, we are hashtag SPSM. There's going to be a curation if you're new to this. It's going to have all the tweets and the video from tonight. And if an hour rewatch the video is too long, don't worry. We'll have a sizzle reel for you too, so you can show your friends. I know. You're thinking, what good is that? But I'm telling you, people ask what we do on Sunday nights. I send them that 3 minutes, and then they're like, good. No, actually, seriously, Chris Maxwell does an amazing job, and you'll be seeing that. We're going to be featuring all sorts of current topics in suicide prevention, technology, innovation, data science, social media, things that are important in our field going forward. We're going to be talking about the ethics and the underlying sort of thought processes behind innovation as it is happening. And that is the reason that you come to this channel. We're now in 5 years, and everybody, I know, everyone started getting restless several weeks ago about when we were coming back. We're glad that you showed up again. So hi to Noreen and Carl and Amber and Rudy and Tom, and who else am I forgetting? There was just a gazillion people, and Marshman, and we had Rye. Was it Rye? Ryan. We had
Rin.
Are
you gonna plug the panel? Plug the panel, April. Plug the panel.
Oh my gosh, Bart, help me out.
The panel. So one of the amazing things, Kate is on a panel that's up for a pick for South by Southwest, which is an amazing conference that I'm sure Tony and April and Kate and Chris will go to and tell me about it while they're there, which is the way things go. But we just tweeted out the link. Vote for the panel picker. Robot meets Freud. Get on the thread. Click on the hyperlink and vote for the friggin' panel.
The panel voting closes in like, what, 2 days or something like that. And so give these folks some attention, share it, retweet the link to the voting, share it on Facebook, vote yourself. Kate, can you explain how that works really quickly?
There are many different factors that go into getting into South by Southwest, and the public popular vote is one of the factors, but there's also an expert panel in the conference committee. So anything you guys can do to help is greatly appreciated, but also check out that there are a lot of other mental health sessions that were submitted this year that I hope this community will find really interesting.
That is totally great, but vote for the SPSM alum, because it's really important for folks who are thoughtful about this topic to be talking about what goes into doing good mental health and innovation. And we want folks, I'm sure that there are people who are as lovely as Dr. Niederhoffer, Dr. Moriarty, and Dr. Cropper-Smith. They are pretty cool. And the guy who hasn't been on the show, it was Dr. Hancock. See? Someday, when you guys go do the panel, maybe he'll come be on. We're 3 minutes over. Thank you so much for joining us at SPSM. Good night to everybody. Good night to you, Daisy. You look very sleepy. Everybody have a great evening. Bye.
Thank you guys. Bye.